Thank you, Alice, and thank you to the Architecture Foundation for the opportunity to share what really is work in progress. My talk is based on a draft of an essay that I've written with some essential context added. And the essay is indeed an afterword for Max Sternberg's monograph on Döllgast, which will be published by Lund Humphreys next year. And Max's work is a fascinating interpretation of really a very wide cross-section of Döllgast's work, which, as Ellis says, is pretty expansive in itself, considering his houses and churches, his works of post-war repair and transformation, his urbanism, and his quite extensive writings. Astonishingly, this will indeed be the first comprehensive monograph on Döllgast. My focus is on fewer projects, and then with the implicit challenge to reflect on them and the body of work from the perspective of contemporary practice. Now, I've been dimly aware of Döllgast's work since at least the late 90s and the early 2000s, as Ellis refers to the publication in 9H and OARS, and then working on a ruin focused this interest and makes you sort of sift between paintings of ruins, like, for example, John Soane, and architects who actually inherited sort of rubble and broken walls and had to focus on acting within them. Our original plan, indeed, for Astley Castle was to roof it first and then repair it after, prompted by the approach that Döllgast took at the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. I've been visiting his projects over the last 10 years and writing this short essay for the last 2.5 years, combing the amazing digital archive of the TUM, visiting a wide range of projects with Max, reading Döllgast's writings, translating a number of them with Anya, my German tutor, visiting the St. Bonifaz archive last year with this sort of intriguing pile of insurance claims related to aerial bombardment raids, and a sort of obviously accumulating tally of damage and financial kind of claims, none of them made good. And then writing draft after draft. This is my 6th full rewrite, and I'm planning a further, hopefully final one. Now, why have I struggled with this? I've been writing stuff about buildings and cities for 30 years, but there are challenges of information, interpretation, contextualization, and even disciplinary perspective. There's not a lot of information or research on Döllgast, so there are some quite large gaps to fill, but that's probably part of the appeal. And the gaps are, if anything, amplified by his entertainingly cagey and backwards writings. I've grappled with his complicity with National Socialism, trying to avoid easy retrospective condemnation or license. So certainly he lived and worked through complicated times, disoriented, irrational, resistant to rationalization. Those times remain complicated. This nags away at any confident reading of his work. Part of the struggle has been to let my acquired experience as an architect weigh as it should, making close readings of the buildings as much as reading about them. I continue to have the feeling of not quite seeing the wood for the trees. But I also sense there's a lot more to learn from and with this engaging and elusive architect. So, from the viewpoint of our disoriented present, facing crises of overconsumption and underproduction, overconsumption of hydrocarbons, underproduction of affordable housing, in which the cycles and stutters of the economy seem to further impede the changes that we know we need to make. From this perspective, the middle decades of the last century, years of trench warfare, pandemic, inflation, economic depression, nationalist populism, total war, reconstruction, feel intimately close, uncomfortably so. The career of Hans Döllgast straddled this period of persistent and deepening crisis in Germany, And for this reason alone, I suppose from a historical perspective or just a human interest perspective, it deserves our curiosity. But of course, the qualities of his buildings invite serious reflection, achieved in spite of the difficult circumstances from which they emerged. So I will talk about Döllgast's work through 4 built projects and 4 clusters of unbuilt projects, addressing in particular 2 aspects. Firstly, the split personality of his work, which I find strangely compelling. Split between the intense realism and absolute economy of means in his buildings and the extravagant gestures of his unbuilt projects. So on the one hand, the buildings shaped by and responding to the hardest of hard times. On the other, the unbuilt projects reacting imaginatively to disoriented times. Second aspect I focus on is this distinctive, highly distinctive combination of rigour and openness in his buildings. This dynamic relation between detail and room, between building and city, between part and whole, which despite the distilled simplicity of language, shows no interest in systematization or modularization that obviously was part of his contemporaries' growing interest in industrialized construction. And I suppose he didn't share that. And perhaps for this reason, his work also then resonates with our post-industrial age, our interest in customization and, of course, adaptation. The variety of Döllgast's works flows from the stops and starts of a tumultuous period in Germany. He was born in 1891, which was probably the first of a whole series of instances of bad timing. He graduated from the TH in Munich in 1914 and promptly enlisted for military service. 20 of his year signed up, 3 returned. He set up his practice in 1927, but as the practice was getting going, the 1929 financial crisis hit construction. An interesting opportunity came up in 1940 when he was offered a post as city architect of Toruń. But there were no good choices in 1940. It was in occupied Poland. A brief flurry of post-war reconstruction work started after the foundation of the Federal Republic in 1949, when he was already 58. But on his retirement from the professorship at the TH in 1956, the opportunities for significant public commissions tailed off. He continued at a high level but small scale until his death in 1974. So in a career of 50 years, there were just 2 brief periods, which are the patches of reddy brown, in which his mature skills matched the burning issues of the day: the housing question in 1928-29 and the reconstruction of war-ravaged Munich in 1949 to 56. So there's a lot of fallow periods, but yet when necessity pressed, he was prepared. Munich's large-scale housing program started relatively late compared to some other cities, say Frankfurt, Berlin. In Munich, it started in 1928. This time lag and the cautious assumptions underlying the program played to Döllgast's experience, working for a number of years in Peter Behrens' studio. And where Walter Gropius, Behrens alumnus, and the like other alumni, Mies and Le Corbusier, where Gropius focused on the industrialization and standardization of housing production, even for low-rise single-family houses, Döllgast and the city of Munich followed a carefully considered position, thoroughly researched by city functionaries, but also practiced by Döllgast in Behrens' office, much of it in line with what Behrens set out in his essay on economical building, applied at scale in the 1920s in Vienna and Berlin on projects that Döllgast was heavily involved in which Behrens weighed the constraints of urban land value, contracting capacity, prioritising the construction of collective housing at medium density in order to make sites close to the city centre viable and to sustain collective facilities and public transport links. So in that sense, a holistic interpretation of the means and the economy of means of urban housing. Döllgast's urban plan for 1,800 apartments at Neuhausen in the west of the city. This is his drawing. Sits in between the east-west canal to Nymphenburg and Schloss and the railway line. So that already prefigures, in a way, this diagrammatic rectilinear layout of the project. So it distinctively combines openness and schematic repetition at the centre with enclosure and adjustments at its irregular edges. So doing this, Döllgast fused this robust simplicity of Behrens's apartment buildings that he was building in Vienna, for example, with Zeilenbau, evenly spaced linear blocks interspersed with gardens, as pioneered by his former tutor Theodor Fischer, so artfully combining rationalist layouts with the shaping of open spaces in the city building tradition. These comparisons on these slides to Fischer's Alte Heide in Munich from 1919, to Walter Gropius's Dammerstock in Karlsruhe, and to Döllgast's collaboration with Michael Kurtz on the Buchenauer district in Augsburg, show this engaging tension in Neuhausen between repetition and irregularity at that scale. At its eastern and western ends, deeper perimeter blocks face and define urban squares. A 370-metre long block lines the north side of the central east-west street. The majority of apartments are provided in simple linear blocks, alternating with shared gardens. These are oriented north-south, and therefore the apartments have east and west aspects. Each street serves one side only. The dimensions are carefully judged, with the gardens separating the four-storey blocks deep enough to have a distinct landscape quality, now filled with mature trees. The single-storey shops and studios interweave with the larger-scale blocks to enclose the gardens and give definition and distinctiveness to the main street with their playful variety. Irregularities of the site are accommodated through localised variations that enrich the whole, such as the triangular garden and small courtyard of artist studios that backs onto it. Through this is the artist studios on the top left. Through this interplay of the built and the unbuilt, deploying a limited number of elements within a specific set of constraints, Döllgast builds a conception of the city that's not a systematic assembly of object buildings, but rather a language of interconnected buildings and open spaces that cohere to form ever greater wholes. Now, the city of Munich had in fact built 12,000 dwellings in the preceding 3-year period on scattered sites throughout the city. For this new programme, again 12,000 dwellings in over a 3-year period, they proposed, it was a change of gear in terms of building on large sites at the periphery, and they were looking for a distinct identity, by implication to communicate a sense of the city government as a social and economic actor, not just a facilitator, to in a way manifest this public action on what I think a number of commentators sort of termed the turn from housing crisis to housing misery. The mayor therefore argued that the estates that composed this programme should not just be made up of individual buildings, but should appear as a single distinct block. Döllgast's design answers this unusual call quite precisely. The commonplace materials, rough cast rendered masonry, wood-framed windows, deep projecting eaves, and the variations of layout and detail resulting from the involvement of a dozen architects give the utilitarian whole an unsentimental softness, modulated in the scale of both buildings and open spaces, legible both as a single superblock and a multiplicity of interior spaces. Neuhausen synthesizes scales, characteristics, even time signatures, with knowing anachronisms shifts of character. It gathers together the urbanized village that the estate borders, the city that it extends, and the metropolis that it helps to form. With no semblance of contrivance, it shifts from a distinctively intimate scale, here at the Künstlerhof, to the edge of metropolitan monotony. As with Döllgast's later buildings, the layout is rhythmically repetitive, both of its elements and of its details. Economy of means underpins the conception, but is not amplified or paraded. Rather, it is customized by handwork, tuned to the place, and complemented by supple adjustments at encounters with the existing fabric. In the economic aftershocks from the Wall Street crash of October 1929, the first phase of Neuhausen required loans from American banks for its completion, and the second phase, to the north, was indefinitely postponed. Over the next 2 decades, between his late 30s and his late 50s, at a stage of life that, for many architects, is their most fruitful and creative, Döllgast's constructional activity was limited by circumstance to intermittent new build houses and churches. He navigated these turbulent times with a mixture of doggedness and hustle, moulding himself to short-term opportunities with a survivor's instinct, deploying his eloquent drawing skills with consistency of compositional approach and a notable political elasticity. In 1931 to 32, Döllgast worked closely with Hermann Zergel on his Atlantropa project. We don't have time to dive into its depths, but it's a crazed but ostensibly peaceful technological fantasy to dam the Straits of Gibraltar and the Bosphorus, lower the Mediterranean, generate hydroelectric power, reclaim large areas of land for settlement, and irrigate the Sahara Desert. A work of infrastructure of continental extent of several continents, scaling up from what actually was the contemporary damming of the Zuider Zee in the Netherlands to take the Mediterranean back to Ice Age sea levels. Zergel's prescriptions for the Atlantropa organization's headquarters required a certain constructivist dynamism that Döllgast struggled with in these sketches, but just couldn't embrace. So he passed that task back. And Fritz Herger, who is known for the expressionist architect who designed the Chili House in Hamburg, took over this element and did it with aplomb. However, tasked with the design of a new entrance to the Suez Canal, displaced from Port Said by the lowering of the sea level, Döllgast could reconcile the practical and the symbolic and deploy his singular representational skills, zooming in and out and hovering over it to consider it from afar and close up, thrilling to the dynamism of this node in the web of world trade. He laid out the port, shipyard, goods and passenger railway stations, airport, airship landing strip, seaplane landing strip, in a rectilinear clustering of infrastructures, adjusting at the edges to an imagined natural topography. At the centre of the whole complex are the column-like lock gates and a tall rectilinear tower topped by a glazed lantern, combining echoes of a monumental factory chimney with Pharos, the lighthouse of Alexandria, echoing the ancient past to anticipate the technological future, using his persuasive powers at the service of geoengineering, Depression-era public works at a continental scale. From 1940 to 44, he worked as city architect of Toruń in West Prussia, before and afterwards Polish Toruń. This wonderful commission, as he later referred to it, offered him unbridled opportunity to test and develop his urban imagination. He drew prolifically, designing dozens of projects, mostly without consequence. The suppleness of his urbanistic imagination is impressive, citing and organising so many and so varied new buildings, adapting and extending existing structures, fitting new institutions to the compact streets around the castle of the Teutonic Knights, entwining them with the landscape beyond the ring of Prussian forts, these black polygons. We'd need a different, deeper inquiry to reanimate and re-entangle the sheaf of about 100 or so drawings that he held on to from his archive, the 20 or so projects, with how this contested city's reannexation to the Reich actually unfolded. Can we read in his designs for the sports complex and for the harbour the triumphant complacency after the lightning victory? In the numerous institutional buildings, his references to Baltic Gothic types feel heavy-handed, exercises in genre. Can we detect beneath any of this grand ambition and surface order, the expulsions of the city's Polish and Jewish citizens, and the settlement of ethnic Germans from scattered corners of Eastern Europe? It's perhaps only in the also unbuilt design for a new cemetery that Döllgast's work in Toruń rises above the dismal circumstances of its conception. It's a work of rare subtlety, both among his own designs for Toruń and alongside the barrack room architecture of the National Socialists. Citing the cemetery beside one of the defensive forts, there's one here, I think there's another one here, he traced an avenue of trees perpendicular to the highway, entwined at the entrance with an array of buildings. This is the entrance sequence and the avenue. To the left, the long, low administration and mortuary buildings lead into the tall, narrow chapel, projecting into the avenue with the crematorium behind it. On the right, the walled and turreted garrison cemetery, a tall cylindrical bell tower, and a rectangular walled enclosure. The cluster of simple volumes, part open, part enclosing, collected in a loose unity through supple, clear grammar, and the landscape sensibility of small constructions in a mature woodland place this design in a long tradition. In the walled enclosure, a peristyle of massive stone columns measured out an open court, with two monumental sarcophagi in its centre. Steps down in opposite corners lead to a pointed arch vault with more sarcophagi. It's an artful assembly of anachronisms that alludes to layers of time, looking backwards to a variety of distant pasts. Its Gothic vault restates the medieval roots of German presence on the Vistula. The subtle conjunctions of simple volumes echo his studies of Roman villas in far-flung corners of the empire, bringing classical poise to his work for the first time. He reinterprets the motifs of classical cemetery design in 19th century Germany, in which commemorative monuments were used to shape the collective consciousness of the nation. In the reverence of the tomb or of the sarcophagus, the hierarchy of the dead, it comes uncomfortably close to Paul Ludwig Trost's Temple of Honor, to the fallen of the beer hall putsch that framed the Königsplatz in Munich. Here on the right, including his drawing of it. What was he thinking? What were his thoughts and motivations? We don't have much more than the drawings and what we know of conditions. In 1943-44, when he was working on this, the Allied armies were advancing first on two fronts, then three, reaching Caen, Rome and Minsk by the time of the last drawings dated July 1944. High explosive and incendiary bombs were falling with growing intensity on Munich. Döllgast spent his nights keeping watch from the tower of the Theash. His city, his own home, were in ruins. The report of the Swiss Consul General gives a sense of the background noise. The very sight of it all, this apocalyptic Munich of July 13th, 1944, no longer turns the thoughts merely to war, but rather to reckless, diabolical madness. And yet, still he drew, a labour of extreme imaginative dissociation. It's impossible to tell what future his design for Toruń Cemetery anticipates. A deluded conviction in victory? A short-term distraction from the falling bombs? Is it a virtuoso exercise in genre? Is it a comforting vision of dignified burial when those left behind would receive anything but? Or is it a private reflection on the last phase of the German presence in the East, a funeral march for the relentless retreat from the edges of Moscow to the heart of Berlin? Within a matter of months, the 1,000-year horizon collapsed into a day-to-day struggle for subsistence, retrospectively referred to in Germany as 0 hour, but in reality an interim condition that lasted many years. The desolation of Munich by high explosive and incendiary bombs was extensive. It took more than 10 years just to remove the 5 million cubic meters of rubble. Once again, Döllgast found his niche, immediately earning the trust of the American Occupation Command, who appointed him Dean of the Technische Hochschule. Döllgast turned his mind to the challenges of the new situation, ducking and diving, decimated, frozen, nothing to smoke, ration stamp economy. He patched up the TH's damaged buildings with student labour and scavenged materials. He built a ticket office to get the central station up and running again for the occupation forces. It would have been around this time that he had a fragment of Heraclitus put up in the courtyard of the TH in large Greek letters, Padarie, everything flows or is in flux. An interesting companion in the devastated city, Heraclitus. All things change to fire, and fire exhausted falls back into things. As day yields night, so winter, summer, war, peace, plenty, famine. All things change. From the strain of binding opposites comes harmony. A strange, oblique reflection on essences that endure, appearances that constantly change, on renewing the rubble and remains, perhaps not intentionally, on his own mutability, and of course, a stranger reaction still that it caused offence. Once again, he drew seemingly without pause. He designed several carpentry workshops, a warehouse for his in-laws' transport company, a number of minuscule houses, an artist's studio, urbanisation plans, apartment blocks, a temporary church, as well as cemeteries, crypts, and a mortuary for his native village. A mixture of the makeshift and the memorial. For an emergency church in an old barrack hut, he designed a tall porch with an exaggerated grandeur, the St. Katharina. A desire for soaring verticality when the population was living on 1,200 calories a day. All, or almost all, unbuilt. Unrealised, despite their extremely limited constructional means, these designs give visibility to the long in-between period, while the Allied consensus held to deindustrialise Germany in order to demilitarise it, resulting in 4 painful years of stuttering subsistence economy and very little reconstruction. A period subsequently referred to as the Niemandszeit, literally no man's time, like no man's land, and in between the National Socialists and the Federal Republic. In this period, under the pressure of scarcity, Döllgast purged his constructional language, omitting again until only the essential remained, shedding weight and bombast, embracing the economy of means, not as an end in itself, but rather as a means. His material palette shrank to reclaimed bricks, timber, sheet metal. Angular, unbalanced monopitches replaced stable double pitches. Finished soffits were omitted to reveal rafters and sheathing. Diagonal braces and gallows brackets bind slender timber posts and beams, and raking buttresses prop masonry walls. Without the budget for representational displays, construction itself became his communicative means. In the ruins of his pre-war St. Heinrich parish church, he found a transgressive energy, proposing initially, it was later rebuilt broadly as was, but in this version, he proposed a monopitch roof that tilts from the light and height of the clerestory windows pinch down towards the compression and darkness of the chancel arch. Like in a Renaissance painting of the Adoration of the Magi, the interplay of makeshift carpentry skeleton with the grandiose but broken masonry shell, expressing the painful, humble birth of something new from the ruins of the old. Already by 1946, he was turning his thoughts to the repair of Munich's institutional buildings. The sheer scale of destruction rendered existing discourses on conservation and repair of very limited usefulness. Döllgast navigated this unprecedented challenge, as always, by drawing, grasping reality through intuition rather than words. Faced with the ruptured end pavilion of the Palace of Justice, he sketched wall repairs in coarse brick, abutting the broken line of its stonework, substituting the absent cornice with a deep overhanging roof. He never gave this approach a name. The labels that others have given it are not unhelpful, but they aren't his. At the same moment, reflecting on bomb-damaged Milan, Ambrogio Noni articulated the same idea of simplified paraphrases which restate, through perspective, alignment, volume, the play of light and shadow, of solid and void, that architectonic sense of the whole that was removed or destroyed. To reflect on the works of these 19 compromised and fruitless years, largely, in another context, Döllgast wrote of the spatial imagination as the ability to dream while awake, the ability to see a promising future in a hopeless present is a professional virtue, it's a necessity. We're forced to be optimists. But taken to extremes, this imagination shades into escapism and complicity. His mastery of perspective scene-making seemed to facilitate, rather than hold in check, his imaginative flights, amplifying his complicity of intent, if not of deed. This body of unbuilt work traces Döllgast's imaginative engagement with his disorienting times, making it a rich and challenging resource, a valuable historical record of a creative soul blowing in the wind, responding to the triggers of economic depression, conquest, devastation, with fever dreams of continental infrastructures, ethnic settlement, and transcendence through faith. Here, even before his works of reconstruction, his work is date-stamped, oriented like an oscillating compass needle to the hoped-for future, the longed-for past, the raw present of one day after another. These projects also trace a creative evolution, refining and distilling how buildings piece into the urban scale, the memorial role of durable construction, the communicative power of a limited language of inherited elements. In other words, in these largely fruitless years, he rehearsed and refined the approaches that informed all his subsequent work. Döllgast understood better than almost any contemporary Viollet-le-Duc's dictum that the architect is and can only be part of a whole. He starts what others complete or finishes what others have started. Renewing the broken remnants of a series of 19th century monuments in the ring outside the medieval city walls, he responded to the specificities both of their architectural language and their degree of damage. While his colleagues Sepp Ruff, Gustav Sanger, and Josef Wiedemann all built in the medieval heart of the city, Döllgast's interventions were in the 19th century grid to the north of the old city, the Maxvorstadt, including St. Bonifaz Abbey and the Alte Pinakothek, and to the south, the Alte Südfriedhof. So St. Bonifaz, the Alte Pinakothek, and then here this whole stretch is the old southern cemetery. To compensate the new Bavarian capital's lack of Roman antiquity or imperial pedigree, Ludwig I and his architects had made Munich a kind of museum of architecture, with monumental buildings in the ancient Greek, early Christian, Byzantine, high medieval and Renaissance idiom. Yet beneath these borrowed clothes, these buildings shared the same rigidity of composition, a repetition of identical elements, and emphasis on direct structural expression, betraying the influence of French rationalism, a side effect of Bavaria's alliance with Napoleon. Klenzer, Leopold's court architect, studied under Durand in Paris and worked for Percier-Fontaine. In Döllgast's hands, by accepting rather than erasing the mark of destruction, these stagey monuments gained the aura of antiquity that their creators had craved, and by removing decor and adding without flourish, he emphasized their metronomic rationality. At St. Bonifaz, fire had left the church roofless, and a direct hit had severed the apse, the crypt and the abbey from the southern half of the nave. Döllgast shaped a legible but incomplete new whole from the encounter between the order of the original and the formlessness of the ruin. He transformed the monumental five-aisle basilica into a short, squarish Greek cross, consolidating the church in the remnant shell with only minimal additions. A large new gable wall in sheer reclaimed brick closed up the gaping hole and completed the truncated nave. Stepping forward to shape and enclose the choir, that gable wall is sheer and blank in the extreme, the flush outer faces concealing a gradual hollowing out of the interior of the wall. The tall choir wall was buttressed by two deep piers, here topped with statues and perforated by small square windows in the depth of the roof trusses, but amended for construction into three round arch windows continuing the rhythms and proportions of the nave clerestory. He re-roofed this compact shell with copper sheet salvaged from the ruins on delicate new carpentry roof structure. This retained and reordered torso feels in no way fragmentary, but is focused and intimate, newly vertical. The work of repair and renewal fundamentally transforms the found condition. Döllgast's interventions alter the organization while retaining the deep structure of the previous whole, working opportunistically to recompose the remnant and the added parts into a different identity. Around this strong, austere centre, the retained and new corner cells accommodate the font, a raised gallery for the monks overlooking the altar, a Mary chapel, and in the southeast corner, King Ludwig I's sarcophagus, a final discreet resting place after he'd tried several more monumental iterations in the plans. The sarcophagus was itself pieced together from broken shards. He teased the retained columns into a mismatched, spoliated feel, so as if they'd come from different buildings, with a new four-square capital, a hybrid of classical foliage and blunt geometric form atop the nave columns, and then the ravaged capitals with brute concrete plinths on the side aisle columns. The windows are ornamented only by the names of the apostles. Wall niches for arms and candles also bear Döllgast's distinctive script. Just two anomalies unsettle the whole, the overall order. First, the two columns, wedged in open gaps in the end wall, speak of the interrupted fate of the original basilica. Secondly, the delicate new timber roof trusses, which are syncopated half a bay off the line of the columns and the walls, imply a gentle, endless continuation. Döllgast seldom explained his projects at any length. His autobiography is no exception. But he does recount the reburial of King Ludwig I in the company of a couple of labourers and the bishop in a snowstorm on the building site, delighting in recounting the macabre encounter with a skeleton in full military uniform. A raising of the dead that combines morbid reflection and commemorative action, processing the all too vivid present indirectly by revisiting the distant past. Now, we don't seem to know much yet about the contemporary reception of Döllgast's works of reconstruction, but in the archive I found the typescript of a 1951 newspaper review in which the renewed St. Bonifaz found an astute interpreter. What has emerged from the ruins of such a joyless counterfeit is so surprising and authentic that it would send an art historian into a beautiful dream. It begins, asserting clearly the superiority of the renewed building over the derivative original. The reviewer reads echoes of antiquity in traces of destruction and metamorphosis, resonances of the basilica type, writing as if the building is in fact a Christian transformation of a Roman hall of justice, before reverting to the present to conclude, everything here appears as a fresh start and a new self-consciousness. Are we again at the beginning? Everything is still in a state of becoming. Everything is still possible. What an obligation. By evoking an ancient past through the dismal present, Döllgast's work stirred a memory of hope. Döllgast had unfinished business at St. Bonifaz. The church is in fact all that remains of his work there and has in fact been altered quite a lot. But as well as grappling with the basilica, he returned and again to the pastoral spaces and to the relation back to the abbey and to the city. The original St. Bonifaz complex was anomalous, not to say aberrant. A three-part composition of a classical exhibition hall to the north, facing onto the Königsplatz, a three-story monastery building in a figure of eight, not particularly monastic, and then a long basilica meeting the Karlstrasse in an open narthex. In the 1949 renewal, he proposed to link the consolidated church back to the abbey with a new ancillary wing in a lean-to along the still standing west wall here, and then with the apse retained as open space, shaping the remnant colonnades into a partial cloister garden, drawing the remains back into something approaching a recognizable monastic form. That connecting wing was only partly realized, I think, a couple of bays, and subsequently destroyed, yet the intent was clear. The courtyard idea reappeared in his projects for further renewal of the abbey in the 60s, first completing the cloister with wings on both sides and then carving an atrium between a rebuilt church and the street. The consistent thread through 8 alternative versions over 20 years is the exploration of the relation of the church to the monastery to the city. The many iterations illustrate the almost infinite permutations of even a limited vocabulary. They demonstrate Döllgast's restless, open-ended search for the elusive identity of a new whole amid the flux of changing needs and resources. At St. Bonifaz, Döllgast proved the proposition the most economical structure is the one that is already there. A distinctive and radical interpretation of modernist economy of means, embracing existing capacity. In following projects, he further distilled new additions to a minimum of material, resuming the interest in delicacy and lightness explored in a number of unbuilt church designs in the 1920s and 30s, adding steel to his limited palette, enabling a radical attenuation. Throughout the National Socialist period, steel had been almost exclusively limited to industrial and military usage. Famously, at a time of foreign currency shortage, iron ore imports were even prioritised over dairy goods. This is John Hartfield's photo collage, Hurrah, die Butter ist alle, the butter's finished. So they're all eating metal. While designing his heavy masonry structures in occupied Poland, he'd sketched this radio mast. With interest, perhaps a touch of envy. With the division into two Germanys, industrial production resumed. The strong caps on steel production were lifted, and steel was finally available for construction. Döllgast's younger friend, Sepp Ruff, seems to have been the first to use steel pipes as makeshift columns here in his 1951 apartment building on Theresienstrasse. And Döllgast was enthusiastic about this new possibility. As he put it in a lecture in 1954, only a ridiculous fogey, an architectural malcontent, would not use every opportunity to build in steel. He revelled in its delicacy. Mannesmann's seamless pipe process had been adapted to make shell and bomb casings, gas canisters, leading to a five-fold expansion of the firm in the National Socialist period. Breakup under the Americans, partial reassembly of the conglomerate under the Federal Republic, and integration in the steel industry, now conceived in the early 50s at a European scale. So Döllgast's use of steel is part of a practical approach to minimise loadings on masonry buildings made unstable by bombing. It's part of a visual language of attenuated continuity between present and past, congruent with the 19th century monuments, but distant from the National Socialist stark, heavy classicism. But is it also possible, by using steel, and above all by exposing it in his repair of the city's monuments, that he also speaks of pacification? In the words of the prophet Isaiah, "And he shall judge among the nations and rebuke many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more." Even in the market economy, there are no innocent choices, nor actions without resonance. In the explicitly memorial setting of the Alte Südfriedhof, close to new burials in 1943, Döllgast enjoyed a relatively free hand, transforming it into a form of memorial park, demolishing and tidying with surreptitious vigour, clearing the remains of broken buildings and reordering the profusion of tombs. His edits largely erase the echoes of the Renaissance in the original arcades and replace the formal coherence of the two 19th century colonnades, which bound each half into a tight unity but divided the whole because it had been expanded. So it really was two distinct spaces. He distilled the ruins, or less euphemistically, selectively demolished them into a sequence of heterogeneous elements, a succession of half-open, half-closed spaces, not unlike his design for the cemetery in Toruń. And through this strategy of fragments, subordinating these smaller parts to a new, looser whole, he reduced the long semicircular arcade of the northern half to the two brick edicules at the two ends, like Roman tombs, keeping just 4 of the original 96 columns and piers, forming a pedimented gable, turning the funeral chapel behind into a lapidarium for remnant sculptures. With this reduction in footprint, he emphasised and celebrated the shift in axis between the two halves of the cemetery, creating a forecourt with fountains and a basin, with these animal-like water spouts out of bent metal, turning Gartner's vaulted transition into a freestanding gateway, opening up the lateral public route that already existed, but widening it through the site. In the southern half, he replaced the masonry arcade with its slow rhythm of trusses on every column line, with a more elemental, oriented porch along the northern edge only that had been on 4 sides. An elongated colonnade with its open side turned to the sun and to the beautiful landscape, to borrow his description from of Roman portico villas from the study that he started in 1913, kept working on, and finally published in 1960, which gathers together his thoughts on the interplay of flickering fashions and enduring types in the classical tradition. In contrast to the centred quality of the original, the tilt of the monopitch roof and the imbalance between walled and open side shift the emphasis outwards to the park-like former burial ground. The columns are like a fine screen in between the cyclical growth of the graveyard trees and the frozen time of the stone memorials. And the staccato rhythm of rafters recedes into infinity without any secondary rhythms, aided by fine steel tie rods and steel cross-bracing below the sheathing boards. Delicate, weightless, and fixed with crude bolted base plates. The fine steel posts, like the carelessly slender stalks of Roman wall paintings, are barely the girth of a forearm. They are 5 times slenderer than the slimmest classical order, reviving and perhaps even detoxifying the grand, simple, repetitive order of classical convention. In the lush cemetery, the everyday life of the city is distant, and the suspension of weight and extension into infinity seem to halt or slow time. Cardinal Vendel gave this perceptive interpretation at the opening. How Döllgast repairs the old damaged buildings, how the older architectural order is respected and interpreted, how reducing the components, materials and details to a minimum produces a maximum of the intended effect, how this enables a more comprehensive interpretation of the term economy than the usual one, how necessity becomes a virtue. The Alte Pinakothek is Döllgast's most emblematic work, but it was also his most compromised and contested. So, in fact, it's quite good to approach it with a bit of a run-up, with a sense of Döllgast's identity and approach. As with all the state art galleries, the collection, which stretches from Giotto through Dürer to Rubens, had been moved out to storage in underground caves, alongside plundered artworks, including the Ghent altarpiece. The building had been tailor-made to accommodate the collection, was heavily damaged. A direct hit severed the south facade facing the city. The roofs burnt off, and their elaborate plaster decor collapsed. Many architects advocated demolition and a new building to embody new values. Soon after the war, Döllgast became a vocal campaigner on behalf of the ruined art gallery, obstructing bulldozers, exhibiting in 1946 this scheme of humble repair, with just patching up the inner wall, popping in a few clerestory windows, this interruption of the cellular sequence and leaving the outer colonnade open. He printed a scheme for his students to hand out to voting councillors, closing up the facade with an abstracted paraphrase of the arcaded masonry facade. When the Conservatives in the Bavarian parliament didn't react to his stabilisation proposals, he lobbied the Liberals and Socialists, won an off round. His proposition was backed up with cost estimates, 830,000 marks, about £2 million at today's values, according to the Bundesbank calculator. To roof and stabilise, about the same again to fit it out. In all, not much more than £350 a square metre at today's values. And 2 years to dry it out. This is 1951 already, so it had been open to the elements for 7 years. Yet his works there were far from light touch, recessive or conservationist. The demolitions of surviving fabric were extensive. He replumbed the building circulation, inserting a pair of grand stairs along the south facade, which had the original staircase had been in the end pavilion. opportunistically using the void broken open by bombs. And he carved out routes and voids for new ventilation systems, all at the service of Klentz's remarkable enfilade of top-lit vaulted galleries. Pevsner, in his History of Building Types, written in the post-war period, considers the Alte Pinakothek one of the best gallery buildings ever built, and he sort of mentions it was damaged and repaired. Infilling the bomb crater at the heart of the building with not one but two constructional languages was the unintended outcome of the complex process. The archive drawings trace the evolution of this delicate temporary solution and the opening to the city that it made possible. So you see here this sort of colonnade with a balcony into a glazed curtain wall, abandoned, according to Döllgast, for cost reasons. And then its transformation into the design we know now, this weighty wall of brick with large windows. The slender steel posts, 250mm Mannesmann pipes, 19 metres high, sketched out a shallow entrance colonnade facing the city, its light timber roof structure covering paired monumental stairs in a soaring entrance portico, turning Klentz's gallery inside out, making an open entrance like Schinkel's Altes Museum in Berlin. The brick piers, on this left-hand image, anticipating the balcony that never came, to look back through the portico, over the park, to the city. Briefly opened to the public in 1954, in subsequent works the staircase was enclosed by the rough, perforated brick wall and covered, that we know, and covered by a thin concrete slab, and the entrance was shifted to the north side. The reappointment in 1953 of the former gallery director Ernst Buchner, dismissed by US occupation forces in 1945 for his role in the theft of the Ghent altarpiece, and then reappointed under the Federal Republic, presented Döllgast with a tenacious and opinionated client. An advisory committee of experts scrutinised his proposals and tabled their own alternatives. His conservationist proposition required cooperation with extreme conservatives. The building that opened in 1957 seems to be the outcome of his frequently conflictual relations with them. The process was complex, as is often the case with public commissions, and the result is in places contradictory. This is especially so on this emblematic south facade, where you have the adjacency of such different intents as the steel columns on the exterior, which are as slender and provisional as the concrete and brick piers on the interior are massive and durable. Döllgast was sufficiently ambivalent about the result to write later that the south facade is not really by me. The tubes were freestanding at one stage. Yet, his work at the Alte Pinakothek transcends the contradictions and tensions of its making. His repair of the exterior nonchalantly embraces its imperfection. Temporary and permanent delicacy and weight are fused in tension, opposites bound in a tense harmony. The redundancy of column and wall on the south facade speaks to the classical tradition of the original building more richly than either on their own would do. With his demolitions and additions, he systematically eliminated elements of intermediate scale, suppressing Klentz's silhouette of statues and prismatic roof lights, replacing them with new low-pitched roofs and projecting eaves, reinforcing the horizontality of the old box, taking the rhythms of the classical language and making them abstract and mechanical, without reassuring hierarchy. His sly concrete pediments added over the heavy cornice of the projecting side wings discreetly anchor this shift in emphasis. His coarse brick infills paraphrase missing bits of wall, but also layer the ordering of the facade. The raw masonry inserted into both the facade and the internal entrance sequence is a visceral interlude in between the delicate stone mouldings of the exterior and the grand vividly coloured galleries, like flesh and bone beneath the skin. In the galleries, the palette of parquet floors, textile wall coverings, and smooth plastered vaults reinforces the grandeur of the central enfilade and the intimacy of the north-facing small cabinets. The light is soft and cool. It reflects on the polished plaster doorway linings. His crisp bronze lettering punctuates the journey through. They are superficially much altered since the 1950s, but the volume and the detail are the same. It would need some careful sifting of the archives to distinguish, since in fact, as on this right-hand image, coloured textile wall hangings were tested under Döllgast's lead in 1955. My impression is that Döllgast shaped the gallery strongly, creating intimate cabinets for smaller works on the north side, reducing the height by inserting a mezzanine office level above. Building new rabat vaults with plaster and concrete on a matrix of steel reinforcement, approximating the earlier volumes but with a new lightness. Beneath the roof structure that, in his words, borders on the improbable, like a butterfly closed its wings and broke. Minimal both in material and in form, leaving different options for the galleries open. You can see on the right the remnant of brick vault here, the springing. And partway up here, the first floor, because in fact you're stood at ground level. In other words, both outside and in, he used his constructional sense to submit to the upside-down logic of the ruin in order to direct it, starting at the top, then building up from the ground, before finally squeezing new fine concrete vaults tight against the roof structure. Advancing the project, picking off decisions sequentially from strategy to detail. The combination of political lobbying and logistical chess grandmastery, enabling patient refinement and sequential judgments, even if he didn't win every battle. This, it seems, is the full range of skills that an architect needs for this nature of project, and which Döllgast possessed. Albrecht Altdorfer's Battle of Issus. If you go, don't just look at the building. There are some remarkable paintings, and this is one of them. It's one of the foundational works of the collection, commissioned by one of the Grand Dukes of Bavaria. It draws multiple overlapping conceptions of the past into the web of the present, rhyming the 4th century BC battle between Alexander and Darius with the contemporary conflict between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Ottomans, resonating with the apocalyptic expectations of the early Reformation, the last battle. Similarly, Döllgast's repairs and additions entwine both actual and remembered layers of time. The original gallery building invokes Bramante and Raphael's Palace for the Emperor Pope. Döllgast's remaking carries echoes of late imperial portico villas, ancient Roman basilicas, Baroque palace stairs. The remnants transmit the time of construction and the peace after Napoleonic Wars. The scars witness the National Socialist catastrophe. The infills speak of the austere years of reconstruction. Expedient new construction is artfully interwoven with inherited classical language games, drawing out the covert interlinking of the before and after, composing history from hope and memory. In his essay, Air, War and Literature, W.G. Sebald has examined the paucity and inadequacy of contemporary writers' responses in the 40s, 50s and 60s to the trauma of wartime destruction. In his words, there was a tacit agreement, equally binding on everyone, that the true state of material and moral ruin in which the country found itself was not to be described. He summarises that from the outset, the now legendary and in some respects genuinely admirable reconstruction prohibited any backward view, characterising the rebuilding as tantamount to a second liquidation of the nation's own past history. Architects, by contrast with writers, could not ignore the ruins. They could instruct their clearance in the name of a clean break with the past, as many did. They could crush them and reuse them mixed in concrete, as Gottfried Böhm did at the Fatima-Kirche in Kassel. They could incorporate them in memorial tension to the everyday, as Rudolf Schwarz did at the Gürzenich Festival Hall in Köln. Döllgast's transformations of broken buildings in Munich are simultaneously down to earth and in the grand tradition. They are both expedient and resonant. Indeed, their expedience is itself resonant. They neither hide nor parade their damage, but transform the interrupted parts into new open holes, integrating the dissonance of brute brick and raw steel and the harmonics of exaggerated weight and lightness within deeply literate readings of inherited compositions and rhythms. At a distance of time and culture, it's tempting to see them as works of raw authenticity, infused with a kind of penitent austerity. My reading is that in the extreme circumstances of reconstruction, just as in the preceding turbulent decades, Döllgast approached these buildings with a profound imaginative dissociation, with his feet in the dismal present and his head in the centuries of architectural history. The pathology of the architect. It applies to all of us in some respects. The difference to the earlier works is that in the post-war reconstruction, his imaginings were distilled into minimal form by the crushing pressures of scarcity. In addition, there was no need for him to introduce anachronisms, since the combination of old and new made the buildings temporally multiple. And above all, the fundamental distinction is that his imaginative dissociation was almost universally shared by his contemporaries, who vividly felt the epic dimensions of the present and reached into the dimly remembered past to help process it. As both victors and defeated struggled to digest unprecedented destruction, they intuitively reached for ancient history, debating a Carthaginian peace or invoking the ruins of Troy. As Marx had observed a century before, in unprecedented circumstances, humans anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service, borrowing from them names, battle slogans, and costumes in order to present this new scene in world history in time-honoured disguise and borrowed language. Döllgast's skill consisted not in conjuring up the dead of world history, for they'd already been summoned by the original builders and unleashed by random destruction, but in allowing their contradictory voices to speak. Döllgast started his career as an urbanist with the design of Neuhausen. He continued it at the scale of the city in occupied Toruń. In his work of reconstruction, he continued to think and work as an urbanist, at the scale of individual buildings, but also at the scale of the city. At St. Bonifaz, he sought to reorient the abbey to the city, make space for its pastoral life. He remade the Alte Südfriedhof as a memorial park open to the neighbourhood. He looked to reorient the Alte Pinakothek with an external porch, stair and balcony back to the city. Each of these was part of an urban proposition. Contemporary with this work transforming the city's broken monuments and analogous to them is Döllgast's Amalienplatz project, which further dispels any deceptive impressions of caution and delicacy of touch in these other works, which is in this area. In an area of particularly extensive bomb damage, in the Maxvorstadt, a short distance to the east of the Alte Pinakothek, he proposed a new urban square in the heart of the 19th century city, defined by a new cluster of mid-rise blocks on two sides, that's then here, and then by existing buildings, including the neo-Gothic Matthiaskirche on the other sides. He proposed an imposing 18-storey masonry tower, responding to a step in the street line, terminating the long Gabelsberger Strasse, its height calibrated to the tower of the repaired neo-Gothic St. Marcus Church on the opposite corner. He explored the tower's local and wider relations in dozens of street level and skyline perspectives, representing and reviewing the project from every aspect. again here offering the tantalizing prospect of a Hans Döllgast curtain wall. The tower echoes and answers the bell towers and spires of the city's churches in a characteristic European domestication of the high-rise, seen as an American import, conceptualizing the isolated tower as a discrete topographical signifier, as a new neighborhood marker. Amalienplatz parallels and expands the urban dimension of Döllgast's monumental transformations, accepting the accidental void, reforming its edges. It scales up from the building to the city, the opportunistic appropriation of destruction, and proposes a confident dialogue between present construction and the inherited fabric of the city. He made clear the coherence of his architectural and urban thinking in a rare aphorism, commending the task of urban renewal to students, stating that in your hands the past will once again become present and future. Topped with a helipad, the tower translates the growing national mood of the 1950s of economic and technological self-confidence, once again bending with the times, resuming the future-facing tilt he'd briefly essayed in the early 1930s, in dialogue with the city's medieval skyline. To conclude, across a wide variety of scales and types of commission, over the 5 decades between his first and last buildings, Döllgast's work consistently combines clear thinking and careful making in the approach to both the restructuring of what has been and the construction of what is emerging, to borrow Fritz Schumacher's phrases, for the two sides of the architect's work, which shouldn't be separated, but for most of the 20th century they were. Döllgast's work misaligned with his most vocal contemporaries, almost as clearly as it fits with the challenges of our present. In a period, then, when buildings were valued as prototypes of scalable systems, as anticipations of future ways of life, as instruments of social improvement, there was little in his approach that courted majority opinion or invited critical championing. Indeed, his projects stood for a different conception of language, of time, and of the agency of the architect. By accepting a language of time-worn conventional elements without the authority of the ancients or any overt political purpose, by observing the logic of what has been in what is made, he sacrificed the ability to tailor buildings to the perceived specificities of the present moment, foregoing the promise of substantive change, knowing that delivering on that promise is largely not in the gift of the architect. But these losses are traded off against the neutral durability of the resulting buildings and are compensated by the emotive resonance that familiarity bestows on the elements of construction, in which convention establishes a congruence between new parts and inherited ones, allowing for changes over time to be recognized and understood. A dynamic of the invariant and the changeable, of the timeless and the date-stamped, everything flowing. Returning to our present predicament, we are now faced, in Bruno Latour's words, with the necessity of redoing everything once again in a strange combination of conservation and innovation that is unprecedented in the short history of modernism. Döllgast's work offers us some clues on what this combination of conservation and innovation might look like, and the processes by which we might arrive at it. Working with an economy of means, with measured and effective material and resource use, in compact proto-urban layouts on city-edge land. Using the capacity of existing structures, adding the minimum of new material, in which a distilled simplicity of language enables a congruent response to broken, inherited structures, in which the work with ruins and remnants is part of an ongoing conversation of rule and exception, of repetition and syncopation, of overlapping orders at different scales. Embracing repetition both within buildings and at the scale of the city, making unsentimental declensions of basic types, combining these in the collectives of the big city, interweaving with multiple identities and secondary types, encountering the existing city with an engaging suppleness. Döllgast's work shows the rich possibilities of a way of building that isn't dependent on systematization, on modularization, on canons of taste and beauty, but that makes a language out of a limited vocabulary of elements, a family of walls, columns, windows, roofs, abstracted or attenuated versions of known forms, a language that learns from the empirical evidence of historical types, interpreting their evolution over time, reading and anticipating the scope for one inherited archetype to morph into another, or to tilt from the known to the unknown. In other words, his work is an unusually subtle exploration of rationality in building. It's one strand of a scratchy, irregular thread to which the name rationalism is inconsistently applied and doesn't really do justice, which binds together Enlightenment empiricism, geometry, modern norms, postmodern awareness of limits. I sometimes wonder, looking at the production of my tribe in the architectural world, if European rationalism is really all we're left to work with, at least in Europe, in terms of a credible response to complex challenges. I've discounted a number of unserious alternatives. But Döllgast's work makes me think that with sufficient humility and imagination, this approach still holds a very substantial possibility. Döllgast's work is also a link in a longer, barely written history of transformation, in which architects took inherited works and intervened, passing them on in altered form, continuing what others had started. His work shows us the possibilities and limits of an incomplete, open-ended language, in which rationality is always partial or multiple, in which broken buildings and unfinished cities are analogues and manifestations of our mortal bodies and of the fragile transmission of culture between generations. Döllgast's work supports the case, even in times of crisis and disorientation, that the making and remaking of buildings are one and the same discipline, and that care for the part and vision of the whole are interdependent. Thank you.